all the fun part of this evening. We've got a number of things to do, but first I'd like to introduce our speaker, John Bagnasco. He's coming to us from Southern California. He's got a radio show, gardenlive.com. Garden Life, I'm sorry. It's the wine. I do believe John's also responsible for introducing a rose with Elsina's name. A little bit of influence in the district. So, John, you're going to talk to us about hybridizers? Yes. Excellent. Please welcome John. Thank you.
That's all right. Well, I want to thank you for having me. And I have to tell you that some of you will find tonight's talk extremely interesting, and some of you will wonder, why is he even here? For those of you that are in the latter group, please don't snore too loud, and I think the rest of you will enjoy it. The title of tonight's talk, Makers of Heavenly Roses, is I took from a book by Jack Harkness, which is called The Makers of Heavenly Roses. Excuse me. And I feel that it's important to maintain rose genetics and rose history, and do whatever we can as rose lovers to make sure that these things don't become lost forever. When I visited the Bagnasco Garden in Italy and was looking at 300 roses that were the last of those individual varieties in the world, it made me think that, you know, any minor catastrophe in this rose could be lost forever. So anyway, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the people who have brought us the roses that we're growing today. It's a 2.5-hour presentation, so I'm going to talk fast. Any questions, ask me afterwards. Okay, the picture you're looking at right there is a rare photo of a bunch of rosarians, some famous rosarians that gathered in London in 1913. And they were the newspaper, the Daily Mail, had a prize for the best rose of the year, and it was awarded to Joseph Pernet-Duché, who we'll be talking about later, who introduced a group of roses called Pernetianas. And the rose that they were there to celebrate is the rose in the upper right-hand corner, Madame Edouard Herriot. So we'll talk about some of these hybridizers that are pictured there. Just briefly, number one is Peter Lambert, a German. Oh. Okay, next. There we go. Next is Angèle Pernet, who was Joseph's daughter. 3 is Marie Guillot, the wife of Henri. God, what was Guillot's first name? Mr. Guillot. I sat between Elsina and Muriel, and they kept pouring the wine, so I'm lucky I can even stand up. Number 5 is Pernet-Duché. 6 is E.G. Hill, from an American from Indiana. 7 is Alexander Dixon from Ireland. 8 is Constant Super from Luxembourg. 9 is Pierre Guillot. 10 is George Paul. 11 is Adolf Fehrenwald, who is a former president of the American Rose Society. So that's the end of that. We're going to discuss right now some of the European breeders, and we'll go over the French, the English, the Germans, and then some miscellaneous breeders, the Italians, Danish, and Spanish. And these are the French breeders that we'll go over. Jean-Baptiste Guillot is who I was trying to think of before. And then the others there, we'll talk about them as we discuss them, I guess. So Guillot had a son, and the one that we're going to talk about really is his son, Jean-Baptiste André Guillot. Guillot Nursery was founded about the time that Lyon had become a center for rose growing in France. And breeding at that time was basically left to Mother Nature. When the hips were ripe, the breeders would go out, if you want to call them breeders, or the growers would go out, and they would gather the roses, usually after a frost, and then they would mix them with damp soil, and they'd keep them in boxes or pots and overwinter them with a sheet of glass to keep the mice out. And it's whatever Mother Nature brought is what we ended up with. Now, Guillot Sr. began growing roses in 1829, and in 1849, he invented the process of shield graft budding on dog rose seedlings. That's the first time that roses were grafted. In 1852, the Guillot that was pictured, his son left his father, and he created his own firm. He became best known for creating the first hybrid tea, which was La France in 1867. And I'm sure you all know that OGRs are any roses that were introduced prior to 1867, which marks the beginning of the first hybrid tea, or what we accept as being the first hybrid tea, because there were hybrid teas before that we just don't recognize. In 1875, Guillot introduced the first dwarf repeat flowering polyantha, which was Paquerette, which means daisy, and he died around 1893. This is Joseph Pernet Duché, the Wizard of Lyon. He was born in 1859, and he took the name Pernet Duché upon his marriage to Marie Duché, who was the daughter of one of the famous rose breeders of the time in 1882. He was a pretty eccentric person, but he was much loved by rosarians all over the world. He relied in his breeding solely on intuition. There's no science involved. It's whatever combination he thought would make a good cross. In 1900, he crossed Rosa fetida persiana with a seedling of a hybrid perpetual that had red flowers, Antoine Duché, and he created Soleil d'Or, which is the ancestor of all the modern yellow roses. And in 1910, he bred Rayon d'Or, which was the first yellow hybrid tea, and now recognized as the first of the Pernetianas, and it was an important ancestor of peace. Now, Pernetianas were the first roses where the yellow color was exhibited extensively in that class. Now they're just referred to as hybrid teas, or whatever their class is, but then they were a group known as Pernetianas. Because he used Rosa fetida persiana in his crossing, for a long time, yellow roses were subject to black spot, and that's how black spot actually entered into the rose world, was through this particular species rose. Up till then, there really wasn't any black spot in roses. Joseph's two sons were supposed to have taken over the business, but both of them were killed in the First World War. And so he had two roses to commemorate their lives. One was Souvenir de Claudius Pernet and Souvenir de Georges Pernet. And both those roses were such good roses that they're still grown. Those are two of his roses. The one that we saw in the first slide that got the Daily Mail Award in 1913, Madame Edouard Ariot, and then Chateau de Clos Vougeot. Has anybody grown Chateau de Clos Vougeot? I've planted it probably 5 times and killed it 5 times. It's not an easy rose to grow, but I love saying Chateau de Clos Vougeot. So I'll probably try again. When he was ready to retire, he arranged for Jean Goujard to take over in 1924, and then he died 4 years later. This was probably one of his most famous roses, and certainly the one that exists in commerce the most today, Mademoiselle Cécile Brunner, which some of you recognize or hear called Cecil Brunner. But the correct name is Mademoiselle Cécile Brunner. Jean Goujard was, by 1934, after taking over from Pernet Duché, was the largest rose grower in the Lyon area of France, and he was producing 250,000 plants per year. He came from an old horticultural family which had several generations of head gardeners at the park at Versailles. You might recognize a couple of his roses. Madame Marie Curie, which won a double ARS award, and Rose Goujard, which I was surprised at the exhibition form of this when I saw it. It's not very common and would probably be almost a perfect rose if it had any fragrance, but no fragrance to it, but I really like it. Charles Maurran was an interesting person. He was called the magician with color because of the different colors that he added to his rose breeding. He began his career as an engineer in central heating, and as soon as he had the money and an excuse, which he said was his health, he retired from engineering to breed roses. And he brought scientific methods, precise scientific methods to his work, unlike the breeders who went by intuition or by chance prior to him. In 1929, this is important, he decided to invite all the French rose growers and their sons to see his new roses. And Antoine Meilhan brought his son Francis, and Francis was so impressed that he began hybridizing roses the same year. The reason that's important is because Francis was the person who hybridized peace. So had he not been impressed with Maurran's work, he probably would not have gone into rose breeding. The rose that Maurran had invited people to see was Madame Pierre S. Dupont, or Dupont. And it was one of the leading roses for many years, and tens of thousands of these were sold by Robert Pyle of Conrad Pyle. It was named for the wife of Pierre S. Dupont, who was the creator of Longwood Gardens in Kennett Square in Pennsylvania. Supposedly he had a really good sense of humor, and this is exhibited in 1937. He wanted to name two of his roses after his daughters. And the one that lived in Paris didn't want her name used. She didn't want to be commercialized, so he named one Lilette Maurran, and the other he named after the daughter in Paris who didn't want a rose named after her, La Parisienne. In one instance, he was awarded a gold medal, but he insisted that another one of his roses really should have got the medal because it was more deserving, and replied with, "The jury is ignorant, it knows nothing." Which I heard today at the judging, by the way. I was eavesdropping. I won't tell you who said that. Two of his roses that you'll probably remember, won double ARS awards. Lowell Thomas is one, and Horace McFarland is one. And an interesting story about Lowell Thomas, on the evening of October 6th in 1943, this rose was presented to Lowell Thomas on the radio, and it cost $3,000 worth of radio time, and 10 million people were listening to Lowell Thomas's America's News Voice of the Year, as Robert Pyle presented it to him, and gave him a bouquet of those roses. And Thomas said, "Well, I don't know how to express my thanks, but I think it would have been more appropriate to name the thorns after me, not the rose." Then we move to the House of Meilhan. The House of Meilhan has had a close association with Conrad Pyle and star roses over the years. And Jack Harkness said of the House of Meilhan, to praise, justify, and thank the Meilhan family, only 4 words are needed. They gave us peace. And those are some of the key hybridizers in the Meilhan family. It starts out with, in the upper right-hand corner, with Antoine Meilhan. He was known as Papa Meilhan, and that's where the red rose was named after Papa Meilhan. That is an extremely red or fragrant red hybrid tea. Then his son Francis, who was the one that went with his father to visit Maurran when he was invited. And then his son, Alain, and today most of the breeding is done by Jacques Mouchat. Charles Maurran, after that visit, wrote to Francis and referred to him from that point on as my student. about the fact that the American rose grower Robert Pyle was coming to France. And backed by Melron's recommendation, they signed a contract to introduce the Mayan roses into the U.S., and that relationship is still carried through today. This is the most famous rose of the 20th century. For a while, it was known as 3-35-40, and that meant that it was the third combination of a cross that was made in 1935, and it was the 40th plant out of the 50 that survived from that cross. And of course, you know it better as peace. These are some quick pictures of Mayan roses, maybe not their best or their most famous, but some that I really like. This one I was responsible to get introduced into the United States. It's called Ladybug, and it's one of the very few roses that has spots instead of stripes. And it also happens to be the parent of a rose we're going to talk about later called Alcina Dean. Some other, maybe not so well-known roses from Mayan are Fantastique. Has anyone grown Fantastique? The color is unbelievable. It really is Fantastique. And also, you don't have to worry about it outgrowing its space, because I've never seen one over 2 feet high. So I'm thinking about grafting it onto Fortuniana, yeah, to see what happens. And then Papa Mayan, we talked a little bit about. Charles de Gaulle, I think, is probably one of the best lavender roses of all time. And why it's not grown more, I have no idea. Extremely fragrant, and I just love it. And then Michel Mayan is another nice hybrid tea. Couple florist roses. The Mayans have been really strong in growing florist roses. Leonidas or Leonidas and Black Baccara, both extremely unusual roses and both extremely difficult to grow. The Romanica series of roses was Mayan's answer to David Austin. And for Californians, I think they probably do better than David Austin's if you want to keep them in check. Since California, the California climate is more alike the climate in France than it is in England, the roses are better behaved, I find, than the David Austins. If you have a lot of room, the David Austins are nice, but if you don't have the room, the Romanicas are better. All four of those up there are extremely fragrant and nice roses. Nicole Carroll Miller and September Morn were two roses that I saved from destruction and helped Starr introduce. Nicole Carroll Miller was named after a young girl that went down in Flight 93 in Pennsylvania. She was 21 years old. She was coming home from college, and she got on an earlier flight just so she could get home quicker. And she was from Chico, right? Her parents came up to me at the Chico Fair and asked how to go about getting a rose named after a person. And we talked for about 15 minutes before I finally said, why, who do you want to name it after and why? And they told me the story, and I said, I will make sure you get a rose. And then September Morn, I'm going to go off on these tangents, so I'm going to have to not tell too many stories. But September Morn, I saw in the test fields up in Portland, and I was there with Jacques Farrar from Star Roses, and it was right next to a red rose called Preference, which is a very nice red floribunda. But this was next to it, and they were telling me about the red rose. And I said, but this white rose is beautiful. Are you going to introduce it? And Jacques said, no, we're just going to plow it under. And I said, why? And he and Bill Mann, who's the president of Star, was next to him. And he says, because you can't sell a white floribunda that's not named Iceberg. And I said, if I come up with a way to sell it, will you save it? And they said, well, let us know quickly. So that afternoon, I came up with the idea to come up with a series of roses honoring 9/11. And September Morn was the first. Nicole Carroll Miller was the second. And then the third, fourth, and fifth names I had given them, and they said, we don't like this series. It's gruesome. We're not going to do it anymore. So anyway, we did get these two, and I'm glad I was able to save them. Nicole Carroll Miller, by the way, has a great fragrance. And September Morn has Iceberg as one of its parents. It's like a an iceberg with better form. Francis Mayon died of cancer in 1958, and he was only 46 years old. And and his son, I'm just realizing that my train of thought is not working up there the way I have it written. Yes, no, definitely don't need more wine, maybe some water. But anyway, Jack Harkness said of his son, Alain, that I often think that working in the Mayon organization must be like camping on a volcano. One would never know what its volatile leader would require tomorrow. His nature, like the skill of John McEnroe, is to return shots faster than they arrive. Then one sees him kindly, solicitous, hospitable, and charming, as if there were nothing in the world but roses and friends and peace. Okay, now we'll go quickly to the English breeders, and those are the ones we're going to cover quickly. Henry Bennett is known as the father of the hybrid tea, and he was one of the very first people to begin to practice scientific rose breeding to create his roses. And he all started growing roses in 1868 because he felt that his farm needed an alternative source of income. So he decided to breed the roses, and he made trips to France, and he started visiting each one of the breeders in France. And he was surprised to find out that they didn't practice the same type of breeding that he did with his cattle, that it was all haphazard. So he started selecting roses the same way he selected his cattle for certain characteristics that he wanted carried over. So in 1879, he introduced 10 of what he called the pedigree hybrids of the tea rose. And the Horticultural Society of Lyon, France, dubbed them hybrid teas, so that's where the term came from. And over the space of about 10 years, he raised a number of roses that some are so good that they're still with us today. However, not everybody was as enthusiastic as Henry Bennett was at the time, and Benjamin Kant in his 1880 catalog said, "Bennett's hybrid tea roses have turned out to be perfectly worthless. It's as well to give them a trial for another year before throwing them away, which I expect will be their ultimate fate." But one of his roses was Lady Mary Fitzwilliam, which is one of the most important ancestors of all today's hybrid teas. And that was a cross between Devoniensis, which is a tea rose, and Victor Verdier, which was a hybrid perpetual. And that's where the hybrid tea came from, hybrid perpetuals crossed with tea roses. It was named for the granddaughter of King William IV. The Reverend Joseph Pemberton produced a class of roses that I think are probably some of the best landscape roses ever produced. Those were the hybrid musks. And when he was 22 years old, the summer after his father died, he decided to enter some of the family roses, mainly ones that his grandmother had grown, into a rose show. And he won second prize. And so from that moment on, he was hooked on exhibiting roses. So he and his sister Florence would travel all over showing their roses. In 1882, he took some to a show in Kensington, South Kensington, and asked for permission to stage them not for competition. And he labeled them, the exhibit, as Grandmother's Roses. And everybody that saw them were amazed because even though it seems like that was a long time ago, old garden roses had already, for the most part, disappeared, and everybody was looking to the newer hybrid teas. So he wanted to breed roses that his grandmother used to have with the intention that they would be even better and they would outbloom what his grandmother had. And he called his first roses hybrid teas. But if any of you know what hybrid musks are, they look nothing like hybrid teas. So the secretary of the National Rose Society called them hybrid musks, which is also kind of strange because there's almost no musk rose in them either. These are some of his roses that you may be familiar with: Kathleen, Norma Hall, Cornelia, and Penelope. Those are all hybrid musks. George Paul is one that I just threw in there because I don't think he should be forgotten. He was either the brother, the cousin, or the nephew of William Paul. You can find him listed as all of those. And William Paul was the person who wrote the book The Rose Garden in 1848. I know that some of you like to collect old rose books, and this is the earliest one that I have. I have an 1848 copy, and I find it interesting. But Paul's main breeding was to breed some important ramblers and some pillars. Paul's lemon pillar is one that I have. I really like. Unfortunately, it's only once blooming. Paul's Himalayan musk is another important one. And Una is not sold in the United States, but that's a hybrid canina. One of my favorite breeders of all time, Edward Burton LeGrice. He was born in 1902, and his first crop of roses was ready for sale in 1921. So if you do the math, he was only 19 years old. And during the 1930s, he introduced the first roses that he himself had bred, and that started out with a cherry red hybrid tea called Mrs. F.J. Jackson. But one of his most successful roses, and one that we certainly need to be thankful today, is a rose called Dainty Maid, because that was one of the parents of David Austin's English roses. His practice was to make a few crosses and raise a few of the seeds, and if they gave him the desired results that he wanted, then he would repeat the cross the following year with much greater quantity. The thing about LeGrice, that one of the reasons I find him so fascinating, is that in a time when there were no unusual colors in roses, when you didn't find grays and browns and lilacs and silvers, he was breeding those roses. Unfortunately for him, everybody during that time wanted red roses and white roses and pink roses, so his roses didn't sell. But today they're all classics, and you know the way modern rose breeding's going. And so everybody wants those colors today. His book, Rose Growing Complete, is a classic among rose books. He was also really famous for his singles. He has some really charming singles. There's Dainty Maid up there in the upper right-hand corner, and then Lilac Charm, Dairy Maid. He also has a red one called Dusky Maid, and then Ripples are all really nice roses. Some of his unusual colors, Vesper and Victoriana. Victoriana is also another one of those bushes that's kind of hard to grow, but the colors are just amazing. I don't think a picture could ever do it justice. There's all kinds of colors in there, some kind of dusky grays and silvers and the deep roses and a little bit of orange and sometimes a touch of yellow. Love that rose. Some other unusual colors, Gray Dawn, Jocelyn, which I'm sure some of you have grown, which is a really deep burgundy color. News, which is a brilliant purple. Sam McGreedy, actually all the McGreedys, there were 4 of them, 4 Sams. And Sam the 4th is the last because his son is not going to carry on the rose business. But they started in, Sam McGreedy the first started on 10 acres in Ireland. And Sam McGreedy, see, I get these numbers mixed up, but his son began breeding roses in 1895 and won his first gold medal about 10 years later. That was Sam McGreedy II. Sam McGreedy III brought production to up to 800,000 plants in 1928, so that's quite a few plants. And then Sam McGreedy IV introduced his first roses in 1958. Then he moved the firm to New Zealand in 1972, and he's the one in the little wash tub there. And that's as he grew up. He has some roses that aren't grown that much, but I find really intriguing. One is Pandemonium, which is a floribunda. And then Santa Catalina, which is a climbing floribunda. Has anybody grown that? I just discovered that at Descanso Gardens, and it roots very easily. We're going to have one in the Coastal Rose Society auction this year. But Sam McGreedy, if any of you like reading rose history, he wrote a book called The Family of Roses, which I'm really intrigued by. He's got some great stories in there. And one of the stories that's in there is when he worked with Jackson and Perkins. Gene Borner, who we'll talk about fairly soon, was one of the most famous breeders that Jackson and Perkins had. And they signed a contract with McGreedy to introduce his roses. And McGreedy would keep turning roses over to Gene, and Gene would always encourage him, but he never introduced any of his roses to the U.S. And they were at a show in Europe one year, and there were some Americans over there, and everybody was crowding around McGreedy's booth to look at his new roses. And they were just saying, we've never seen things like these. They're fantastic. And Gene Borner also happened to be at that show, and he walked into McGreedy's booth with this crowd around him, and he says, you know, Sam, if you keep this up, someday you're going to be a good breeder. And McGreedy was, I don't know if it was his Irish temper or what, but he was so furious that he went over to Robert Lindquist, who was representing Howard of Hemmett's Roses at the time, and said, would you like to introduce my roses, because I'm not working with J&P anymore. So to complete this story, at Rose Hills a few years ago, Sam McGreedy was there, and I brought a copy of his book and had him autograph it and told him how much I enjoyed the stories in the book. And a lot of the stories are drinking stories, because I guess there was a pretty raucous crowd back then. And he looked at me kind of sheepishly, and he says, oh, I'm glad you liked it. He says, but I was a lot younger when I wrote that book, and there were stories I probably shouldn't have told. And so I said, I really enjoyed the story about Gene Borner. And he goes, that was absolutely true, every word of it. So he was still upset, you know, all those years later. So anyway, I think you'll really like that book if you get hold of it. It's called The Family of Roses. Here's some of Sam McGreedy IV's roses. Evelyn Faison, which is a parent for, you can probably tell by the brilliance of the color there, one of the parents of Trumpeter. And Arthur Bell, which I think is named after whiskey. And Brown Velvet and Tiki are all really nice floribundas from Sam. And then he's got quite a few striped roses, too. Maestro, Oranges and Lemons, Priscilla Burton, and Picasso are all his roses. And then, of course, two All-American selections, New Year and New Zealand. Then we go to quickly, just to mention just Dixon and Harkness, because they're so important. Dixon is an Irish rose breeder, and Harkness an English rose breeder. And both of them followed the principles of Henry Bennett. And the Dixon style became elegant buds with really high centers that are great for exhibition, but not a lot of petals, because of the Irish rain, roses that had a lot of petals wouldn't open. So if you ever see a Dixon rose, and for the most part a Harkness rose too, and you live in coastal areas, you know they'll probably do well. And some of them do have problems in the heat, but usually they'll grow everywhere, but they're really good coastal roses. Acapulco is a rose that took me about 12 years to find. I finally had to import one from England. And I wish I knew when they took that picture, because I've been waiting for that moment to see the rose look like that. Elena's a very popular yellow, really nice rose. Harkness is still the leading rose breeder in England. But the nursery was found in 1879 in Yorkshire. And in the 1950s, Harkness popularized Frensham, and for a time, Ena Harkness, which was another one of his floribundas, hybrid teas, was the most popular red hybrid tea in the world. Harkness began developing new roses, Jack Harkness, that is, began developing new roses for the company in 1962. And he improved rose health by introducing genes from wild species around the world. And his early successes were with hybrid teas and later with floribundas. And he's also the one that started working with Hulthemias to get the center ring that's in a Hulthemia into modern roses. For a while, that work was being done by Ralph Moore. And then Harkness turned his breeding over to Keith's area, Jackson and Perkins. And Keith has some of the most spectacular Halthemias I've ever seen, Halthemia crosses, and I don't know if they'll ever get released now that Jackson and Perkins is bankrupt. Though there are a few nice ones that Harkness introduced the last couple of years. I was at the Chelsea Flower Show in England, and I saw two of them, and neither one of them was anywhere near as good as what Keith's area had. So I hope that Keith does get to introduce that. Here's a Livin' Easy's, one of Harkness's most popular roses, but one that's not quite as popular because it's more difficult to grow is Greensleeves. And usually if it's difficult to grow or unusual looking, that means I've got to have it. David Austin introduced just a completely new idea in rose growing, and he wanted to breed the old rose classes with modern roses to make them repeat bloomers and to give them more disease resistant. His first rose, Constant Spry, was introduced in 1963, but it was not a repeat bloomer, it was a once bloomer. And then in 67 and 68 he introduced Chianti and Shropshire Lass. And in 1869 he began getting Remontant varieties, and the first of those were Wife of Bath and Canterbury. So I think his group of roses were the most successful group of roses in the 20th century. Now, Constant Spry, even though it was a once bloomer, is still grown today, and that's one of the reasons it's still grown today. And that's about 1.5 miles from here, over at the Pixar Studios. So if you're ever in this area in the spring, you definitely want to take a look at that. That's about 950 feet. Yes? Yes. I forget the name of the street that Pixar's on. Maybe somebody here knows that. But it's not. You could look it up. It's not far. Some of his roses that I like, I really like Molyneux. I only have a half an acre, and on that half an acre I've got a little over 1,000 roses. And no roses in the front of the house because my wife says that's where everybody drives by and she doesn't want it looking like a jungle. So all these roses are in the backyard, and so if I have a David Austin, I have to have a rose that behaves itself, and Molyneux is one of those roses. Timor is also another nice rose. The Australian breeders, quickly we'll just mention Alistair Clark, definitely the most famous Australian breeder. He was the founding member of the National Rose Society of Victoria in 1900, and he served it as his president. And he released 122 varieties of roses between 1912 and when he died in 1949, the year I was born. But he never grew roses commercially. Instead, he gave the roses to charities for fundraisers or to people that he knew. He would name them after them. He also, for some reason, liked naming his roses after racehorses. But his aim in breeding was to develop disease-resistant, ever-blooming hybrids that would thrive with little care in Australia's dry and warm climates, a lot like some of the California climates. So his roses do very well over here. He used Rosa gigantea almost extensively in his breeding. He has quite a few climbers. Amy Johnson and Black Boy are two famous ones. And then some polyanthas, Borderer and Australia Felix. The German breeders, we'll go quickly. Hermann Kiese, Wilhelm Cordes, Peter Lambert, and Matthias Tantau. Kiese, a lot of people don't know about him, but he was one of the most successful breeders of the early 20th century. And in Germany at that time, he was second only to Peter Lambert in importance. Tausendschön was one of the greatest garden roses of all time. That was one of Kiese's roses. Peter Lambert probably would have been more famous. There's some discrepancy about this, but he did cross a polyantha with a tea rose to produce a rose called Schnitzberg, and a lot of people consider that to be the very first Floribunda. Unfortunately, his garden was in the walls of an old Benedictine monastery in Trier, and it was destroyed in World War II, and all his breeding was lost, and a lot of his roses lost forever. Here's a couple of his roses that fortunately we still have. Frau Karl Druschke and garden director Otto Linne. Cortis is maybe a German version of Mayon. They have a long history of producing roses, and the founder, Wilhelm Cortis, was born in Germany in 1865. And when he was 22, he began a nursery in Elmshorn and sold all kinds of plants, but after a few years he abandoned that and decided to just grow roses. And his two sons, Wilhelm and Hermann, joined him later on. And Wilhelm taught his son Wilhelm taught the next generation of the Cortis family, and that was Reimer, Werner, and Hermann, about the rose business, and they carried it forward till today. And his son Reimer continued in his father's footsteps with the breeding program. So now they're in their fourth generation. And Wilhelm, actually, I think he just retired. But their roses are sold in 30 countries, and they're especially popular in colder climates. They also do florist roses, and these are the roses that always stop people in their tracks. There's another one in that series, Hocus Pocus, which is not available. But all those roses are sports of a florist rose called Frisco. And Frisco looks exactly like those roses, except it's pure yellow. And if you plant any of these roses in your yard, you have no idea what kind of rose you'll end up with. I have Hocus Pocus at my home, and Hocus Pocus looks similar to Abracadabra. But on that one bush, I've had the regular Hocus Pocus flower, along with pure yellow Friscos, and then pure black roses, all on the same bush. Ave Maria and Schwarze Madonna. For a while, I was collecting black roses, and Schwarze Madonna was one that I really liked. Matthias Tantau was born in 1882 in Uetersen, and he had a training period working in the nursery of Peter Lambert in Trier. And as we talked about, that at that time was one of the most famous nurseries in Germany. But in 1906, he came back to Uetersen to build up his own nursery, and he bred one of the first one of the first successful cut rose varieties, and it was called Garnet in the early 40s. And right after the Second World War, there were several million plants of this variety that were planted in the Netherlands for rose production. Any of you who've been to Holland know that the Dutch can't do anything on a small scale. Matthias Tantau took over the company when his father died in 1953. And fragrance is one of the things that Tantau really strove for. There was Prima Ballerina and Fragrant Cloud are two of his rose. And he was known as an uncompromising man who, said that the right way is the only way to do anything. He also developed a rose called Tropicana. And when he developed it, he wanted to name the rose Superstar. I'm sorry, he wanted to name the rose after his wife. But Jean Borner, again, talked him out of it. And so then he said, well, we'll call the rose Superstar, which was fine in Europe. But when they went to introduce it into the United States, Star Roses said, you're not going to call that rose Superstar. That's not our rose. So it became Tropicana in the U.S., but in Europe it's still known as Superstar. Deep Secret and Hot Princess are two of their roses. Hot Princess, you probably, if you exhibit roses, you probably know what a great rose that is to put on the show table. One of the Italian breeders, Domenico Accardi, was probably the most famous breeder in the middle of the 20th century. Today, the Barneys are doing a great job out of Italy. He went to school in Zurich and England, and he imported roses from all different countries, and those roses formed the nucleus of his breeding program. And he still remains Italy's best-known raiser. He's remembered for Signora Piero Pericelli, and also for the Glory of Rome and Eternal Youth. That picture on the right there is the Icardi estate where they grew the roses, and there's a picture of the Signora. And Glory of Rome and Eternal Youth are also two of his. Danish breeder Sven Poulsen's probably the most famous. He was certainly the pioneer of Floribunda roses. And he bred his first Floribundas in the 1920s, but the class wasn't really accepted until 1952 as a Floribunda class. Some people consider, we talked about the German rose that people consider to be the first Floribunda. Some people consider Red Riding Hood to be the first Floribunda. Karen Blixen and Victor Borga are two of his beautiful hybrid teas. Another one of my favorite breeders, Pedro Dot, of definitely the most famous of the Spanish breeders. He was also one of the first breeders to work with miniature roses. We always think of Ralph Moore as being the father of the miniature rose, but Pedro Dot started before Ralph Moore. And his theory was to cross hybrid teas with the miniatures to improve the form, because the form of all the miniatures to begin with was kind of open, and there was no form actually. So he did a lot with that. And he's also known for producing brightly colored roses. If you think of Spain and the colors of Spain, those are the colors that he put into his roses. A lot of them have Pernettiana blood in them, though. That's where he got the oranges and the yellows. And they're not hardy in all areas, but great for California. There's Pedro with his grandsons. And Federico Casas is available in one of my favorite roses of all time. I think I'd probably put it in my top 20 rose list. Has anybody here grown Federico Casas? Do you like it? It's a rose that's about this big, and you know, looks like a Spanish ballroom dress. What do they call those? Flamenco dresses. It's just beautiful. He also did see the world's smallest rose. The story is that it got its name from the fact that it sat in his greenhouse for a number of years, and every time people would come in, they'd go, "Pedro, is that a rose?" And he'd go, "See." And Nevada is a hybrid Moisei, one of his most famous shrub roses, and still an important shrub rose today. Some of his other roses, Tardigrade, Condessa de Sestoga, and Rose Dot. Now we go to the Japanese breeders. Right now, the roses that I'm trying to collect are Japanese roses, and especially the roses of Seizo Suzuki. There's, I don't know if you've had a lot of experience with Japanese roses, but American hybrid teas can sometimes be very stiff and formal. And the Japanese hybrid teas have a grace and elegance about them that I find quite different and certainly more charming than some of the American roses, even though I love American roses. But Tancho, to me, is perfect as you can get in a hybrid tea. Though it's not going to look like Gemini, it will look exactly like that. And if that's not a high enough point to win, then I don't really care if I win. But I do care if I have that rose in my yard. Okay. Thanks, I was dying there. Anyway, Suzuki raised as many as 160 rose varieties, and some of those you know, like Olympic Torch and French Perfume and Mikado, which was the first Japanese rose to win an All-American selection. He always strove for an effective breeding program that was based on scientific knowledge, and he was really interested in the mechanism of the biosynthesis of the pigments and the fragrance in rose flowers. But this is what intrigues me about him, is that he thought that an extensive knowledge of the history of roses and rose-related art was essential for breeders, that people really couldn't breed roses great roses unless they understood all of that. He established a collection of 2,000 roses at the Research Institute of the Keisei Rose Nursery. And in 1941, World War II began, and Suzuki was criticized for growing roses because not only was it a crop that wasn't producing food for Japan, but it was a crop that was the enemy's national flower. So he joined the Navy and was in it for 2 years as a medic, and his wife managed to preserve the 1,000 roses that he had at his nursery. And so after the war, he was able to reopen his rose garden with 300 varieties. And in 10 years, he increased the selections to over 1,000 varieties, and he had species roses, OGRs, and modern roses in there. And then in 1948, although much of Tokyo still remained in ruins, the Suzukis and their friends organized the first post-war rose show in Japan. And it was a great success because it appealed to the Japanese as a symbol of peace and resurrection. So he ended up becoming well respected after that. The Japanese really, I don't know if any of you have been to Japan, but the Japanese really admire their plantsmen over there. And they know the breeders of their roses. And Keith Zeri told me that when he went to Japan, that they treated him like a rock star and that there were hundreds of people that came to get his autograph. There's a few of Suzuki's roses, French Perfume, Gypsy Carnival, and Shiun. I think a lot of the reason that Japanese roses may not be popular is that some of them have names like Asaguko and Asagumo and Hanagasumi, and names that don't roll off the tongue as well as French Perfume. Okay, now we'll get to the American breeders, and those are the ones we're going to talk about. One of the first important one, Dr. Walter Van Fleet, was probably the greatest of the early rose hybridizers in the U.S. But he worked at the Bureau of Plant Industry at the Department of Agriculture from 1905 to the 1920s in relative obscurity. He was known mainly for his climbing roses that thrived without any pampering that the hybrid teas required, and he used Rosa vicarana and Rosa setigera and other wild roses to create what he called dooryard roses. And those were varieties that would combine beautiful flowers, luxuriant foliage, and disease resistant. And he wanted them to be able to survive anywhere in the U.S. American Pillar was his, and Dr. W. Van Fleet. I always thought it was strange he named a rose after himself. E. Gurney Hill was the father of greenhouse growing in the United States. He was born in England, but then he moved to the U.S. and founded a nursery in Indiana. And a lot of you probably heard of the Gurney catalog in 1881. And initially, he only sold European roses, but he soon began hybridizing, and with the help of his son, he started selling his own varieties. In England, he found the rose Ophelia in the field of William Paul, and Ophelia began a whole new race of roses, and many of those went into the cut flower trade. And Ophelia sported, giving the Hill firm Madame Butterfly, and the firm bred from it and turned up the top greenhouse rose, Columbia, and was another rose that also sported freely. General MacArthur and Madame Butterfly are right. Madame Butterfly is right there. General MacArthur, by the way, is not named after Douglas MacArthur because the rose came out in 1908 before Douglas MacArthur was Douglas MacArthur. It was named after a Civil War general. Captain George C. Thomas was born in 1873 and was breeding roses in Philadelphia, and he used a lot of Pemberton's roses in his early work. The roses he bred in Philadelphia are all called Bloomfield something or other, like Bloomfield Abundance or Bloomfield whatever. But then he moved to Beverly Hills and started breeding roses in California and bred Dr. Huey, which was a climbing rose back then. Now it's, of course, a rootstock, something that all of us probably grow. And he wrote the Practical Book of Outdoor Rose Growing in 1914. Captain Thomas is one of his climbers, and then there's Bloomfield Abundance, which a lot of people confuse with Cecile Brunner. Robert Lindquist was a partner of Howard of Hemet, and this is the person that Sam McGreedy turned his roses over to, and they had a good relationship. The roses that they bred were best for warm climates, so if you find any of Howard's roses, they're going to do good in most of California. Granada, Roman Holiday, and Tiffany are some of theirs. Ralph Moore, the father of the miniature rose. I thought it was only fitting that we put a miniature version of him up there. He was born in 1907 and started growing rose seedlings while he was still in high school in the 1920s. And in 1927, he sowed seeds from a huge plant of climbing Cecile Brunner that he got from the garden next door. And one of the seedlings had tiny white flowers on a bush that was about 3 foot tall. But at that time, nobody was interested in miniature roses, and so that plant was lost. But then in 1935, he saw his first Rosa Rouletti, and afterward, he bought some plants of Tom Thumb that were raised by De Vink in the Netherlands, and Oakington Ruby, which was raised by Bloom, and his enthusiasm for miniatures was rekindled. I thought this was a nice comment by Jack Harkness about Ralph, and if any of you have ever met him, you'll know that this rings true. He's a man of peace, not of political peace, but the real peace, which he describes is something of the spirit which can and will not wish or cause harm or loss to another. Those are some of his miniatures right there. And then I like some of his roses that are not really popular, but they're different. Most Unusual Day and Wedding Cake are a little hard to grow, but I had a bouquet of wedding cakes on the table, and we had some friends over, and they looked at it and they said, "Are those roses real?" And they went up and felt them. They said, "Oh, I thought they were fake." And because it has like a plastic feel to it. Oh, before we go into D. Bennett, a quick Ralph Moore story. Claire Martin at the Huntington in Southern California had some roses that he wanted identified, and Ralph was there to give a talk at their Great Rosarian series. And so Claire thought it would be a great opportunity to have Ralph go around the garden and identify these roses that Claire wasn't certain about. And there was a rose called Santa Rosa that Luther Burbank had hybridized. But Claire wasn't sure that it was labeled correctly. So he brought Ralph over and he says, "Ralph, is this Santa Rosa?" And Ralph looked at it and he studied it. And he said, "You know, it could be Santa Rosa, but if it is, it's not the same one Luther gave me." I thought that was really interesting, putting the generations in perspective. Dee Bennett, the first woman hybridizer we have up there. Jean Keneally called her a genius in a man's world. Now, she was born in Australia, but moved to the U.S. in 1940. And she began raising miniatures in the 1970s and started Tiny Petals Nursery in Chula Vista. And Ralph Moore showed her how to propagate and later how to hybridize, which shows you the kind of person Ralph Moore was. He never kept secrets and was always happy to help anyone that needed help. She ended up introducing more than 150 varieties, including some of the very first mini floras. Some of her roses, Bonnie Jack, X-Rated, Jean Keneally, Irresistible. I'm sure anyone who grows miniatures is familiar with all of her roses. John Clements, I refer to him as the American David Austin. He was, for a while, they were the largest growers of miniature roses in the Pacific Northwest, and he began his breeding work in the 1970s. And he went with his wife, Louise, to David Austin's Wolverhampton Garden of Old Roses and looked at those roses, saw them for the first time, and immediately said, "This is where the United States is going to go. This is what we're going to do." And he began breeding the same way that Austin was breeding. He's introduced over 90 varieties. And he saw Jude the Obscure over in England, and David Austin was going to chuck the rose. So the only reason we still have Jude the Obscure is because of John Clements. So he saved Jude the Obscure from obscurity. I put Oblivion up there, but I should have put obscurity. And he just died recently, so that was a great loss. It was just up at his place in St. Paul, just outside of Portland, and I found that there's about, I think it's about 500 of his seedlings that are still there in the fields that they're testing, and they're going to be introducing a couple every year for the next few years. So all his work is not yet lost. I had a quote here from John that where he said that rose breeding, I feel, is more an art than a science. I feel an intense love of the beauty of roses, and through years of trial and error with a lot of intuition and love, I have combined the best of the English roses and many other forms of roses with special emphasis on fragrance, beauty, and disease resistance. So a lot of the heirloom roses have those characteristics. Morning Has Broken in the upper right-hand corner there is still rated as one of the top shrub roses in the United States. Magnificent perfume, definitely fragrant. The Impressionist, a nice climber. Peter Beals was a rose that Peter Beals himself picked out. Well, I know a lot of you are getting really tired, and most of you know the history of Jackson and Perkins, so I won't read that. But they were selling over 3 million roses a year until they went bankrupt. So I guess quantity doesn't necessarily mean profit. One of their first hybridizers was Dr. J.H. Nicholas. Some of you might know the rose, the Doctor, which is a huge pink hybrid tea. One of the largest roses I know was the doctor they were referring to was Dr. Nicholas. He trained Gene Borner, so he was his predecessor, and Eclipse there is one of his roses, and he said that every rose is a good rose somewhere, but that somewhere may be limited to a very few miles of its origin. Then his protege, Gene Borner, known as Papa Floribunda. He used Cortez's Pinocchio and hybrid polyanthas to breed his Floribundas, and had brilliant results, and was putting in 250,000 seeds a year. So with that quantity to choose from, he was able to develop some nice roses. He died in '66. And he left a large amount of money to Cornell University to support graduates that were working on rose research. Some of his unusual color roses, Lavender Pinocchio, Apricot Nectar, Fashion, Gay Princess, which meant Happy Princess back when it came out. First Prize and John F. Kennedy are two of his notable hybrid teas. And then his protege was William Warner. He joined Jackson and Perkins from Howard and Smith in 1963 and became director of research when Borner died. And in 1980, he became the only person to have the Triple Crown in the AARS selections with Love, Honor, and Cherish. And he introduced over 150 varieties during his 25 years with J&P. Some of his roses, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Intrigue, Color Magic, Tournament of Roses. Anne Morrow Lindbergh is the parent of what famous rose that Keith Zeri put out? Gemini, right. And there is Keith Zeri. Eating hula pie in Hawaii. Keith was putting 300,000 to 400,000 seedlings every year. We're not sure what he's doing now. But he was only the second U.S. rose hybridizer to win the President's International Trophy and the Gold Medal Award of the Royal National Rose Society in Britain. And the rose that he won with is called Greetings. Some of his famous roses, Pope John Paul II, Diana Princess of Wales, Ronald Reagan, Misbehavin', Our Lady of Guadalupe, Honey Bouquet. Armstrong Nurseries. A lot of you are familiar with that. John Armstrong founded the nursery in 1889 in Ontario. The reason he moved to Ontario was he was in poor health living in Ontario, Canada, and thought he should move for his health. It ended up being a good move. He wasn't sure where to move to, so figured if he was in Ontario, Canada, he would move to Ontario, California. He started rose research and development that was headed by Dr. Walter Lammerts in the 30s, and they introduced Queen Elizabeth. The company was taken over by J&P in the 1980s when Delbar, the French rose company, purchased them, and two of their breeders, young breeders, left. One was Jack Christensen, who just retired from commercial breeding, and Tom Caruth, who now, of course, is with Weeks Roses. Dr. Walter Lammerts introduced 46 roses, which doesn't seem like a lot between 1940 and 1981, but 25% of those 46 roses were, so 1 in every 4 of those introductions was a double ARS winner. A lot of his roses were really fragrant, and he was the first one to have Queen Elizabeth, which was a grandiflora rose, the first one to have a grandiflora rose. And Ralph Moore stated that Dr. Lammerts was really helpful to him when he was trying to breed minis with moss roses. Anybody watch Seinfeld? Doesn't that look like Mr. Pitt? Anyway, some of his roses: China Doll, Chrysler Imperial, Charlotte Armstrong, Queen Elizabeth. And then David Armstrong, one of John's sons, bred between 63 and 72. He came up with Lemon Spice, Cherry Vanilla, Kentucky Derby. And then Herb Swim, bred for both Armstrong and then later Weeks. And he tried to breed for roses that wouldn't fade in the hot sun and that would drop their petals cleanly. And he also said that the foliage must be really durable with the heat. And according to Swim, the closest he came to achieving his objective was the Rose 49er. I've never really been impressed with that rose, but I guess he liked it. A couple that I'm more impressed with are Mr. Lincoln and Royal Highness. And then Jack Christensen hybridized over 80 roses, and after Herb Swim went to Weeks, he succeeded him. And he's the youngest person to ever develop an all-American rose. He's only been doing it independently since '87, though. The rose below, of course, is not a real rose, but it's an artist's rendition of the rose Joshua Bradley. Swim was the first person to bring stripes into large modern roses. He used some of Ralph Moore's work with miniatures and then put these floribundas, 3 floribundas out. Purple Tiger still remains very popular, and Peppermint Twist and Tiger Tail are a little harder to find now. Brandy and Gold Medal were also his. Then we go to Weeks Roses, which was founded by Ollie and Verona Weeks in Ontario in 1938. And they collaborated with Herb Swim at Armstrong's before Swim went over there full time. But working on his own, Ollie Weeks developed Paradise, Nighttime, Bronze Star, World War II Memorial. And then Tom Caruth. I think everybody knows Tom Caruth, and I think that, in my opinion, Keith Zeri is probably the world's greatest hybridizer at the moment, and Tom Caruth is probably going to replace him very quickly. Tom has done some really interesting work, especially in the area of floribundas. By the way, he's got a new rose out with a horrible name called Coco Loco that I think is one of the most unusual colors I've ever seen in my life. It's not Coco, and he was loco for naming it that. But it's spelled K-O-K-O, and a rose that'll be coming out next year, so you should take a look at that. But some unusual colors, of course: Night Owl, Hot Cocoa, Paul Leckie Jr., which is one of my favorite roses, and we convinced Tom to introduce that rather than throw it out. Marilyn Monroe, of course. Moonstone, City of Carlsbad. Then one last breeder, quickly. Just because I didn't get a long introduction, I thought I would save that for myself at the end here. So anyway, I have a series of roses out called the Little Rascals, and they're mainly roses that can be mixed with in flower beds, in mixed containers. They don't have to be in the rose ghetto. They like other plants. It's a mini flora. It has a white eye and a white reverse. In the petals, the second day turn salmon. So you have these orange-colored flowers and salmon-colored flowers all on the same plant. It was Jack Christensen's tiger tail crossed with the seedling. And blood meal is good for roses, but if you work around this rose, they'll actually have fresh blood because it has razor-sharp prickles. You really have to be careful. Another one of the Little Rascal series is a rose, a great hanging basket rose, I think, Spanky. And then Darla is a miniature, and Marshmallow Fluff is a polyantha. Then a couple new ones. Oh, Gwen Cleary, I think, is probably one of my nicest polyanthas. It was Wild Dancer crossed with a seedling. The flowers open up a deep rose, and then they change to pink, and then they change to light pink, then they change to white, and then the petals drop. So it never turns brown. And this was 3 stems that we cut and photographed, and that's what the bush will look like, just a mixture of all those flowers. A couple new ones I'm working on. Alcina Dean is released this year to a select few. So far, I'm the only person in the world that has one. And that was Ladybug, the Mayan rose that had the spots crossed with the seedling. And it must come from Ladybug, but occasionally, depending on what the weather is, and I haven't pinned it down yet, it'll throw some odd colors of red into the rose. Just a touch of white, but then some different shades of red. But for the most part, it looks like a bush altissimo. And those, the stamens in the center are that brilliant yellow, just like altissimo. The unnamed hybrid tea on the left is Paradise crossed with Madame Violet, or Madame Violette, which is a Seizo Suzuki rose. And the rose looks like that and is extremely fragrant, but I don't know how to keep any leaves on the plant. It's the worst mildew magnet I've ever seen. But the flower's so nice, I haven't decided what to do with it yet. Maybe I'll try to breed it with something that is a little bit stronger and keep the flower shape and put a better bush on it. So anyway, I know that I've kept you here, and I appreciate your patience, but the whole reason for my doing this research on the rose hybridizers can be summed up in a quote from McGreedy's book. Oh, I forgot my newest rose. This is Tangerine Streams, and if you want to know what a stupid name it is, just talk to Muriel. After her 4th glass of wine, she told me that that's the worst name she's ever heard for a rose. But it is a great growing rose, and it has really glossy, disease-resistant foliage. It's going to be in the Edmonds catalog that comes out in October, so you can get one through them, and it'll be released nationally in 2012. And that was a cross. That was a cross between Bill Warner and Honey Bouquet. It does, even though it has a dumb name, it grows well, doesn't it, Muriel?
Yes, but it would have been better as some kind of a sherbet or something. It really has a blending of colors that are gorgeous. And it reblooms. It's a workhorse.
Well, thank you, I think. So anyway, back to what I was saying about the whole reason for this presentation was a quote from Sam McGreedy said, "And the people who breed roses are fun, too. I speak their language and they mine. I would hate that all that pleasure to disappear unrecorded." So thank you so much for your attention. And thanks for inviting me.